Hello, welcome to week 11 of the Redeeming Grace Church Bible Institute Survey of the Psalms. And this week we'll be looking at the poetry of the Psalms. Again, another big topic that we can't exhaustively cover in the course, but I want to at least give you an introduction, some things to be aware of as you're thinking about reading the Psalms and studying them, recognizing how they work in terms of the language can be very important and very useful in helping you to understand them and apply them. So we've said many times the Psalms are poems, but what kind of poetry are they? In what sense are they poems? In their very helpful book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, Gordon Fee and Doug Stewart say the following about the Psalms as poetry. They say, perhaps the most important thing to remember in reading or interpreting the Psalms should also be the most obvious. They are poems, musical poems. On the other hand, literary scholar James Kugel, in his book Great Poems of the Bible, says this: I don't particularly like to talk about compositions like the Psalms or prayers or prophetic speeches as poems, since this word is in any case likely to summon up a host of associations inappropriate to these texts. They are really not very much like what we think of as poetry in the mainstream Western tradition. So Fee and Stewart argue that really the most important thing, or one of the most important things that we need to do to understand them properly, is to recognize them as poetry. And then Kugel says that they are so unlike poetry that it's probably better that we don't even use that word to describe them. Well, so what's going on here? Well, both of these scholars are pointing us to something very important and helpful that we need to keep in mind as we look at the Psalms, and that is this. There are several ways in which the Psalms are wonderful examples of poetry, but it's a poetry that works a little different than what we tend to think of as poetry. There are some important differences. So the Psalms are poetic in that they're literary compositions that use figurative language as well as conventional forms and structures to convey their meaning. They don't work like letters, prose narratives, or other plain language or direct language. There's more involved than that. But they're also different from what we tend to think of as poetry in a couple of important ways as well. The forms and structures that they use are different. And the way they use figurative language tends to be a little bit different. So it might be helpful to think a little bit about English poetry to highlight the similarities and the contrasts between them. If you don't like English poetry, or you're not interested in that, maybe you can skip ahead. But I think it's helpful if you don't know how poetry works in general in the English language. It's going to be hard to see the differences. So English poetry, like most poetry in the Western tradition, is characterized by forms that emphasize meter and rhyme primarily. And in the best poets, these elements all work together along with the ideas and images that are used. And so let's briefly look at this. Here's an excerpt from Robert Frost's poem, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. So, in this example, there's a distinct and repeated pattern of sounds at the end of each line. So, think I know, though, hear snow, queer, near, lake, year, A, B, C, A. da da boot da, like that kind of a drum rhythm at the end of the line. But if you look carefully, you'll notice there's more going on than that. Each of these lines has 8 syllables, and so there's a very constant rhythm that's created, and each of those lines of 8 syllables has alternating unstressed stressed lines. And so when you read this poem aloud, the sound of the poem mimics the imagery. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. You can hear the clip-clop of the horse. And so Frost is a very gifted poet. He's employing imagery, he's employing sound, he's employing end rhyme, and regular patterns of rhythms in order to pull that all together to communicate what he's trying to say in this poem. And so Western poems frequently have conventional forms like that related to the organization of the rhymes and the metrical patterns. So even if there's no end rhyme, they will often draw very heavily on meter and sound play. So for example, Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem, Come Down, O Maid, the end of this poem says this: Sweeter thy voice, but every sound is sweet. Myriads of rivulets hurrying through the lawn, the moan of doves and immemorial elms, and murmuring of innumerable bees. The meter is that each of these lines has 10 syllables that alternate, stressed and unstressed. You might remember, if you've ever studied English, that's called iambic pentameter. It's one of the most common rhythms in English. Poets use it a lot. But notice how Tennyson stacks the S and M sounds. He uses alliteration to connect the rhythm of the meter to the imagery he's using. The poet is focusing attention on the sounds and then uses language to allow us to hear that, right? Sweeter thy voice, but every sound is sweet. So he's introducing this concept of sound, and then after he does, look what he does. The moan of doves and immemorial elms and murmuring of innumerable bees. It's like you can hear the bees. All those M's and S's make this sort of droning sound to it. And so English poetry and most of that in the Western tradition is about those kinds of relationships, sounds and rhythms and images all working together, and often with an end rhyme structure. So Hebrew poetry does use these techniques occasionally, although almost never end rhyme. But it's not characteristic of it the way that English poetry is, or most Western poetry, Latin poetry, for example, or Greek poetry, or any of the Romance languages. The metrical forms that we do find in the Psalms are not as intricate with regard to sound. They rely less on the patterns of sound and more on the patterning of ideas. So Hebrew poetry is more about rhythm of thought than rhythm of syllables. They also, the Psalms as poetry also differ from our poetry in other ways. Our poetry tends to emphasize creativity and uniqueness. If you were to buy a collection of poems and most of it was sort of the same poem, just slightly adjusted, we would find that to be odd and maybe a little redundant, where the Psalms are much more inclined to repetition and commonality in form. They use a lot of the same images over and over, in some cases the same lines over and over, and there are a few cases where entire Psalms are duplicated. And so that's commonality of form, and there are reasons for that, but that's something that they do that we tend not to do. Our poetry tends to express itself also in very flowery language, where the Psalms are very terse. They're very subtle. The language is extremely compact. Slight things in the Psalms really draw out a lot of meaning instead of these sort of vivid, drawn out descriptions that we tend to find. English poetry tends to be very reflective and metaphysical, or very observational and anti-metaphysical. You get kind of one or the other. And there's really no such division in the Psalms, because there's no concept of a physical world distinct from us, from the spiritual world. You know, the psalmist isn't going to go on talking about a flower without connecting it to God and the Creator. The psalmist isn't going to go on meditating about God as Creator without that having some direct influence on the world and the things in it. And so there's no concept of the physical world or the human experience as distinct from the metaphysical realities. Everything in the Psalms is connected to some relationship with God. Where the Psalms and English poetry are similar, however, is that they use this figurative language in a way that allows them to communicate not only facts and observations, but attitudes, affections, and emotions. It's a motive language. and this is really the essence and the magic of all poetry, really. It's probably why, the earliest literature, the earliest examples of literature we have from virtually every culture, in fact, everyone I'm aware of, there may be some I'm not aware of, but it's always poems. The first literary productions that are recorded by virtually every culture is poetry. Because a skilled poet can pack a lot of meaning into a line much more powerfully than what can be done with prose. So, for example, suppose we wanted to communicate the burdens and the worries that a king or a leader must face. We could go on and on describing the stresses related to that person's responsibilities, the threats and intrigues of their rivals, and all these other concerns. We might mention how heavy those burdens weigh on that leader and how difficult it is for a man in that position to sleep soundly at night. Or we can do what Shakespeare does, and he's able to communicate all of that and probably a lot more in 8 words when he says, "Uneasy lies the head that wears a crown." That image captures all of that, all of the concern, the worry, the sleeplessness, the burden. Just uneasy lies the head that wears a crown. I mean, just packs all of that into a few really well chosen words. Similarly, when David is surrounded by enemies and desires God to protect him, rather than go on some big theological discourse about the truth of God's love and his power and his devotion, all what David says, 16 words: "Keep me as the apple of your eye, hide me in the shadow of your wings." So David is able to capture all these truths about God and his desire for God to protect him, and even something about the almost maternal relationship by just picturing God as this eagle, almost like a mother eagle, who isn't going to take her eyes off of her children and is going to protect them and cover them with her wings. And we've got some bird nests out back here, and I tell you, watching those birds protect their nests in the spring is remarkable, because you see both the tenderness and the connection between those mother birds and their concern for their young, in that case instinctual, but and the ferocity with which they will go after anything. Doesn't matter how big of a creature it is, man. They are going to protect that nest. And so David's able to capture all of this truth and experience about God in just a few words with that image. And that's really the essence. So taken all together, in the Psalms we have a body of literature that's poetry, but poetry that works a little differently than what we would normally expect. The Psalms sometimes appear unsophisticated, just because of how simple they look, but as we look closer, we begin to see that they're very nuanced and powerful in their language. the comparison and the linking of ideas and images in the Psalms really requires a lot of meditation and study to really fully appreciate the depth of what's there. I like the way literary scholar Robert Alter captures this. He says, the Psalms are, of course, poems written out of deep and often passionate faith. What I'm proposing is that the poetic medium made it possible to articulate the emotional freight, the moral consequences, the altered perception of the world that flowed from this monotheistic belief in compact verbal structures that could in some instances seem simplicity itself. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a perspective on the Psalms as poetry in relation to other poetry. I think Alter is right on. And most people in our culture today don't spend a lot of time reading or thinking about or studying poetry. So I hope that's been helpful to you as we now proceed to look at kind of some of the poetic elements of the Psalms and their forms. The first thing we want to look at when we see how these work is that you want to be focused on lines, not sentences. We saw that Hebrew poetry doesn't use the rhythm of syllables, but there is a rhythm to it, and it's a rhythm of ideas. And so identifying those ideas are really important to understanding what's going on. And, we train people when they're learning to study the Bible to identify sentences and paragraphs and really draw out the meaning of that, the logical connections between them. And that's just not how this works. There are logical connections, but you need to be less concerned about the sentence and the paragraph and more concerned about the line and what composes the line. So what primarily conveys the meaning in a psalm is the relationship of the sticks. So let me explain what that means. They're organized into lines, and each line is divided into two or more parts. And those parts are called sticks, S-T-I-C-H-S, pronounced stick like a stick off a tree. But so for example, Psalm 46, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. That's one line, two sticks. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. The line captures the sort of the idea or the component that's being communicated, and the sticks are pieces of that, and the relationship between them is what sort of comprises the idea that is communicated. So the bulk of the meaning in the Psalms are carried by the relationships of the sticks to the line. And so each one contributes something. And in a lot of cases, the second piece will always add something to the first piece. And sometimes there's more than two. Two is the most common pairings. Sometimes there's three or four. But it's sort of like something's introduced, something's added. And you kind of think about it like a gem. You take like a diamond or something and you turn it around in the light and you see all these different facets. And that's kind of how these poets work, right? They give you an image or an idea, and then another one right next to it kind of gets you to look at it different or think about it a little differently, or emphasize something about what they were saying. And so that process of doing that is known as parallelism. So what we're going to be talking about is Hebrew parallelism. And probably the most practical thing you can take from this lesson is how the main types of parallelism work, so that as you're reading in the Psalms, you can begin to see what's happening with the relationship of these lines and sticks to one another. And that's helpful because sometimes if you have a single part that's hard to understand, if you understand how the parallelism works, you can look to see what the next stick or the related stick is saying, and that will often help you to understand what is being emphasized or considered. So let's talk about parallelism a bit. So the first kind of parallelism is synonymous parallelism, and that just means that there's a repetition in the second part of what's already been said in the first part. The two parts communicate the same idea in different words. So we have like Psalm 18:4. The cords of death encompassed me, the torrents of destruction assailed me. See, two things, they really both say the same thing, say them slightly different, and it's in that relationship that we really begin to draw out meaning. But just in terms of parallelism, they're saying the same basic idea. Psalm 103:10. He does not deal with us according to our sins, nor repay us according to our iniquities. Same thing. Psalm 135:4. For the Lord has chosen Jacob for himself, Israel as his own possession. So you can see in synonymous parallels, two pieces that are getting at the same idea. Not necessarily an exact repeat, that would be a formal parallel, but a synonymous is same idea, different words. Then the opposite of that is antithetic or contrasting parallelism. And that's where the second part contrasts with the first part. And so again, these kind of work like a 1-2 punch. Usually something said and then emphasis comes with the second one. Psalm 1:6. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. So the second line is really the opposite idea or a contrasting idea from the first one. Not a contradictory idea, but a contrasting idea. Psalm 34:10. The young lions suffer want and hunger, but those who seek the Lord lack no good thing. Psalm 62:4, the second part of that. They bless with their mouths, but inwardly they curse. So the overall idea is being brought out by a contrast that's introduced in the two parts. Climactic parallelism is a third one. And this one is a subsequent repetition. Each line takes a piece of the prior line and repeats it and sort of it expands it. You can think of this one like a staircase. So if you want to call that staircase parallelism, that works fine. So Psalm 29:1. Ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. You see that ascribe to the Lord repeated. So it picks up sort of the same idea. It gives it sort of this momentum in the second line. It's not exactly the same idea because the first one is calling on heavenly beings to ascribe to the Lord, and then the second line is saying what to ascribe to the Lord. But that repetition of that piece gives it this sort of building effect. Psalm 93:3. The floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their roaring. You see, pieces repeated, and it just sort of moves this thing forward towards a climax. It just builds the emphasis. Psalm 96:1 and the first part of 2. Oh, sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord, all the earth. Sing to the Lord, bless his name. So you can see in these climactic parallels or staircase parallels that it's just constantly building on some component that gets drawn on over and over and over. It's sort of this jackhammering effect in the language that makes it pretty powerful poetic device. The next one we have emblematic parallelism. And emblematic parallels are when there's a direct statement connected to another part by a simile or metaphor. So I want you to reverse back to grade school, a simile or metaphor. A simile is a comparison that uses like or as. A metaphor is a comparison that doesn't use like or as, but you understand that it's figurative. So often that simile or metaphor is an illustration of the point that's made. I should point out these also can be synthetic or antithetic, meaning you can deploy this emblematic type of parallel and still have the same idea repeated or contrasting repeated. This is sort of a compound type of structure. So Psalm 31:12, I've been forgotten like one who is dead. I have become like a broken vessel. So you can see here that this comparison here, like one who's dead, that simile comparison. I've been forgotten like one who's dead. I've become like a broken vessel. Just, it's done. It's used up. Nobody worries about it anymore. It's just thrown away. Psalm 38:4. For my iniquities have gone over my head like a heavy burden. They are too heavy for me. You see that like there is the emblematic symbol there. So Psalm 42:1. As a deer pants for flowing streams, so pants my soul for you, O God. So we can see in these that what you have is really a comparison, an illustration of the idea through a simile or a metaphor. This is a common thing. The next one, and this one is a little tough. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, and really, people who first begin to see these things sometimes get carried away with them. Even scholars do. I've read entire books where it's like they're almost rearranging things in order to create these kinds of patterns. We certainly don't want to do that. However, these do legitimately occur, and that is inverted parallels. And there are a couple kinds. To invert something just means to turn it upside down. So all the other things we've looked at involve the sort of the idea side by side. This one is more like a mirroring effect. And so the first one I'm going to introduce is something called chiasm. Chiasm is very common in any oral culture where language is primarily spoken rather than written, because it's a device that helps people keep the organization of ideas clear in their head. And so this kind of thing is used. We see that all through the Bible. The New Testament uses it frequently, so this isn't something unique to Hebrew. But the word chiasm or chiastic comes from the Greek letter chi, which looks like an English X. And so if you think about an X, if you draw a horizontal line right through the middle of that X, a straight line, it looks like a mirror image or reflection of itself. And that's really what this kind of parallel does. These patterns can be very compressed, or they can be spread out over a long section of material. So let me give you an example. When Jesus says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, that's a chiastic structure. Do you see how it mirrors back on itself? The Sabbath was made for man, Sabbath man, not man for the Sabbath. Sabbath man, man Sabbath. It just reflects back on itself. This kind of device is very common in speeches. You know, FDR, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. Or John Kennedy, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. They're just memorable. It helps people remember things. But these can also be used broadly. So, for example, the entire book of Jude, that whole chapter, is organized into a chiastic structure. So where do we see this in the Psalms? Psalm 16:8 through 11 is a good example. I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand, I shall not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad, and my whole being rejoices, for my flesh dwells secure. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. You make known the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. Okay, so this might be a little harder to see, but notice in verse 8, I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand. Then, verse 9, therefore my heart is glad, my whole being rejoices. So idea 1, at my right hand. Idea 2, rejoicing, being glad. Then my flesh dwells secure. So that's a third idea that points to this, will not abandon my soul to Sheol. And then watch what happens. Or let your Holy One see corruption. So they will not let the Holy One see corruption, which parallels the flesh dwelling secure. Then in verse 11, in your presence there's fullness of joy, which parallels my heart will be glad, my whole being rejoices. Then at the end of 11, at your right hand are pleasures evermore, paralleling because he's at my right hand. And so you have this right hand, joy, flesh is secure, no corruption, flesh is secure, joy, right hand. You see that pattern. Often what's at the center of a chiastic pattern is what's being emphasized, and what is at the center here is, for you will not abandon my soul to Sheol. Again, you can go study this stuff, and anybody who's interested in some of these things, let me know, and I'll talk to you about what it is you're trying to study, and I'll try to help you access some resources that maybe will be useful to you. The second kind of these inverted parallel structures are something called envelope structure, or inclusio, you'll hear it called, but it's like an envelope around the material. It's where an idea is introduced at the beginning, then you have the whole section, and it's repeated at the end. There isn't necessarily a pattern in between, but there can be. So, for example, chiastic structures have an envelope, right? At my right hand was at the beginning and the end of that, sort of forming a frame around that. But there was a pattern in the middle. There isn't always. So examples of this are like Psalm 150, that begins and ends with praise the Lord. So Psalm 150, praise the Lord. There's a material, then it ends with praise the Lord. Psalm 118 begins and ends with, oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. So you have that, you have all this material, and then that's repeated again at the end. It's like an envelope around the material. Again, these structures can appear in other parts of the Bible as well, but we do see them frequently used by the psalmist. They don't have to be at the start and the end of the psalm. The two examples I gave you were sort of the first and last verse. They're not always that way. So, in fact, Psalm 119 begins with one. So here's how Psalm 119 begins. Blessed are those whose way is blameless, who walk in the law of the Lord. Blessed are those who keep his testimonies, who seek him with their whole heart, who also do no wrong but walk in his ways. Do you see here walking in the law of the Lord, walking blameless? We see that in verse 1 and verse 3. Who also do no wrong, walk in his ways. So this sort of walking structure is forming an envelope around this first couple of verses. So, that's an example of the inverted parallelism, which those can be those can sometimes be distracting. You want to make sure that you don't overthink that, because it could be that you're seeing repetitions in a longer structure, which is why I don't. I think you want to have a little bit more familiarity with working with the other parallels and interpreting them before you really start focusing a lot on them. But when you do find them, they are interesting in terms of how they move things along. Those kind of structures in other parts of the Bible are also helpful. The last one that I'm going to introduce is synthetic parallelism. There are a lot of other figures of speech and devices and poetic techniques used in the Psalms. This is just a survey course. We're not going to get into all that. But again, if you are interested in that, if you're interested in the poetry of the Psalms, the structure of the Psalms, let me know, and I will help guide you to some resources that you can start with on your journey of studying this, that will be a little more accessible and clear to you, and then you can go from there. A lot of the books that I've seen people recommend, or a lot of the books that often get referenced, are require a little bit of working up to. So, for example, I quoted from Robert Alter earlier. Alter is he's writing for other like literary critics and scholars, and so you that's probably not where you want to start. Although his work is good, not a Christian, just a very competent Hebrew scholar. Anyway, the last one that I want to introduce is synthetic parallelism. And synthetic parallelism is when the lines are put in parallel, but the ideas aren't really very neatly balanced. They're often just an expansion of an idea rather than a true parallel. An example of this can be found in Psalm 148. Praise the Lord from the earth, you great sea creatures in all deeps. Fire and hail, snow and mist, stormy wind fulfilling his word. Mountains and all hills, fruit trees and all cedars, beasts and all livestock, creeping things and flying birds. So these lines, or these sticks, are put together in lines that do create sort of a thought rhythm, but it's not truly a parallel. Honestly, this is probably the hardest one, because it often ends up being like a catch-all for anything that doesn't fit into the other categories. And that brings me back to something that I really want to close with, or remind you of before we finish up, and that is that these things aren't mathematical equations. These are devices that are used. It's something that's a common characteristic of the way the language works. But if you start trying to think that any of these patterns are like the secret key that's going to unlock everything, it just doesn't work that way. You just really need to prayerfully take the time to read and think about what you're reading, and to look carefully at how it's put together. And there's all sorts of nuance to it. And some things just don't fit neatly into a category, and that's okay. It's poetry. I don't think we would want it to do that. But just to sort of review, Hebrew poetry works a little different than other poetry, but the key thing is that the language is so dense, and it's a motive language. It's able to capture affection and attitudes because it's so image based, and so illustrative. So it requires us to work a little harder and to think a little bit about how is this like this, or how is this unlike this, and in that, bringing those together, the emphasis is drawn out, which requires a little more work than reading a letter, but the power of it is amazing, because you can pack so much in to such a few words. So the types of parallels, again, synonymous. There are two sticks or two lines, a line's comprised of two parts that say the same thing, emphasize the same idea. Then you have the opposite, contrasting parallels, or antithetical, but contrasting parallels, which a contrast is introduced, which brings out the idea. There's the climactic types, which is that staircase structure that, there's this jackhammering effect to the language. Emblematic, which really I would just say is almost like similes and metaphors. That's the way you can think of it. The relationship to the lines and the sticks are in simile and metaphor. That's what draws them together and connects them. Inverted parallels, where you have something repeated, not one right after another, but sort of a series of ideas that then mirrors back on itself. And then, the envelope structure is also an example of that, and sometimes it's a little more detailed, which would be like a chiastic structure. Then you have the synthetic stuff, which is, these things are balanced, but it's really more just moving the idea forward, rather than being a true one-to-one kind of balancing in the poetry. So I wanted to introduce this. A lot of classes start with this information. I wanted you to really just be thinking about the Psalms as a bigger body of literature and how they work as prayers and and all of that before we got to this. But I did want to introduce this to you before we do the next few weeks, which is where we will be actually studying some of the Psalms. So we have all this background in our head, hopefully, with regard to how they connect to us, how they connect to our worship of God, how they point to Jesus Christ, the types, and now we have a little bit of exposure to how the language within them works. And so I'm really looking forward to the last few weeks here where we really dig into some of these Psalms and look to see how they work as individual units. So again, if you have any questions or is anything you don't understand, if I went through it just too quickly or the notes don't make sense, use the discussion boards, reach out to me. The only homework for this week is really just leaf through your book of Psalms and see if you can identify these. Now, I'm not even saying go look for all of them. I'm just saying, pull out a few Psalms that you're going to read when you do your devotions or your prayer, and then take a moment to say, okay, do I see any of these used here? And if you would like to interact with me about that, I'm happy to do that. Use the discussion board, and that way other people can benefit from what you're observing. I'd be happy to do that. But that's the homework. Just see if you can start to pick out some of these devices in the Psalms that you're reading, and then certainly over the next few weeks when we begin to study individual Psalms, or as we're studying individual Psalms, we'll be drawing on some of this as well as all the other stuff that we've looked at. So I'm really looking forward to that. I hope this is helpful to you, and I pray that the Lord would bless you in your study this week. God bless.